Plane ticket to my brother of the housewarming cost my parents $940 round trip, but the 45-minute drive to my wedding was somehow too far. That sentence has lived rent-free in my head for almost a year now, and I still cannot say it out loud without my jaw tightening. My name is Rachel Bellamy. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Hartford, Connecticut. I am telling you this story because I think there are people out there who need to hear it. People who have spent their entire lives wondering why love in their family always seems to come with a price tag attached to someone else of the name. The morning of October 11th, 2024, I woke up at 5 in the morning in a little bed and breakfast in the Berkshires. My wedding was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, and the leaves outside the window were the color of fire. I remember pressing my forehead against the cold glass and trying to breathe through the knot in my stomach. My fiancé, Daniel, was in the room next door, probably still asleep, probably dreaming about the life we were about to start together. And I was standing there, 33 years old at the time, waiting for a phone call from my mother that I already knew was not coming. The night before, she had sent me a text, just one line. "The drive is too long, sweetheart. We are not going to make it. We will send a card." That was it. 12 words to cancel on the most important day of my life. 12 words after months of me sending her the venue address, the hotel block information, the rehearsal dinner invitation, the registry. 12 words after I had personally booked and paid for a hotel room for her and my father, because I knew if I did not, they would find an excuse. And they found one anyway. The thing is, exactly 1 month earlier, on September 14th, 2024, my parents had boarded a plane from Hartford to Phoenix, Arizona. They flew across the entire country for my older brother Marcus and his housewarming party. Marcus had just bought a 4-bedroom house in a gated community, and my mother had been talking about it for weeks. She had bought a new dress. She had gotten her hair done. She had baked her famous lemon pound cake and carried it on the plane in a special carrier that my father had built out of cardboard and foam. They stayed for 5 days. 5 days for a housewarming. And 45 minutes was too far for my wedding. I should back up a little. I have always known that my parents loved Marcus more than they loved me. I think every second child knows this on some level, but in our family it was not subtle. It was loud. It was obvious. It was something the whole extended family talked about at Thanksgiving when they thought I was not listening. Marcus was the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong, the firstborn son who carried the family name and the family hopes. I was the afterthought, the girl who came 3 years later, the one who was told from the time I was 6 years old that I needed to make myself useful around the house because nobody was going to do it for me. Marcus got piano lessons. I got chores. Marcus got a car for his 16th birthday. I got a bus pass. Marcus went to a private university in California, and my parents paid every dime of his tuition. I went to a state school in Connecticut and worked 2 jobs to pay my own way. I do not say any of this because I am bitter, although I suppose I am, a little. I say it because by the time I got engaged in March of 2024, I had already done so much work in therapy to accept that my parents were never going to be the parents I wanted them to be. I had decided I was going to invite them to my wedding anyway. I was going to give them one more chance. Daniel did not understand. He grew up in a family where his mother still kissed him on the forehead at 36 years old, and his father called him every Sunday just to ask about the weather. When I told Daniel that my parents had skipped my college graduation because Marcus had a tennis tournament that same weekend, he just stared at me. He did not have a framework for it. He kept asking me if I was sure I wanted to invite them. And I kept saying yes, because some stupid little part of me, the 6-year-old part that still lived inside my chest, kept whispering that maybe this time would be different. Maybe a wedding would be the thing that finally made them show up. It was not. I stood in that bed and breakfast at 5 in the morning, and I read the text from my mother for the 14th time. I had not slept. My eyes felt like they were full of sand, and I made a decision, right there, that I was not going to cry on my wedding day. I was not going to let 2 people who could not even drive 45 minutes ruin the most beautiful day I had ever planned. I got dressed. I let my best friend, Vivian, do my hair. I walked down the aisle to a string quartet playing a song that Daniel and I had picked out together, And I married the man I loved in front of 72 people who did show up, who did love me, who did think I was worth the drive. But here is the thing about pretending you are fine. It works for about a week. Maybe 2 if you are really good at it. Then it cracks. I came back from my honeymoon in early November, and the cracks started showing. I would be sitting at my desk at work, reviewing a quarterly report, and suddenly I would be crying. I would be in the grocery store, picking out apples, and I would remember my mother of the lemon pound cake and have to leave my cart in the aisle and walk out to my car. Daniel was patient. Daniel was kind. Daniel could not fix what was broken inside me, because what was broken inside me had been broken for 33 years before he met me. I stopped calling my parents. I stopped responding to my mother of the weekly text messages, which had resumed about 10 days after the wedding as if nothing had happened. She sent me pictures of her garden. She sent me a recipe for butternut squash soup. She sent me a link to an article about saving for retirement. Not one word about the wedding. Not one apology. Not one acknowledgement that she had missed the single most important day of the life of her only daughter. For 2 months, I went silent. I did not call. I did not text. I did not show up for Thanksgiving, which I usually hosted at the house I had owned for 6 years. I let the holiday pass like any other Thursday. Daniel and I ordered Chinese food and watched a movie about a dog. I cried a little when the dog died, but I think I was really crying about something else. And then, on the evening of December 18th, 2024, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my whole body go still. It was my grandmother, my mother of the mother. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 87 years old, and she lived in a little house in Vermont that smelled like cinnamon and old books. I had not spoken to her in almost 3 months, because she had been in the hospital for a hip surgery, and then in rehab, and I had been too wrapped up in my own grief to call her. The guilt hit me like a wave when I saw her name. I answered on the second ring. Her voice was thin and a little shaky, but it was unmistakably hers. She said my name twice, just to make sure it was me, and then she said something that made me sit down on the edge of my bed and grip the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. She said, "Rachel, there is something you need to know. I have kept it for too long, and I am not going to take it to my grave." She paused, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Then she said 5 words that changed everything. She said, "It was always yours." I did not understand. I asked her what she meant, and my grandmother, 87 years old, sitting in her little kitchen in Vermont, told me a secret she had been keeping for 26 years. The story my grandmother told me that night began in 1998, when I was 7 years old and Marcus was 10. I do not remember much from that year, except that my grandfather, my mother of the father, died in the spring. His name was Harold Whitfield, and he had been a quiet man with thick glasses and hands that always smelled like sawdust. He owned a small lumber business in Vermont that he had built from nothing after coming home from the war, and by the time he died, that business was worth a great deal more than anyone in our family realized. My grandmother told me that when Harold passed away, he left behind a will. A very specific will. He had written it 3 years before his death, when I was 4 years old, and he had been very clear about what he wanted. The lumber business itself was to be sold, and the proceeds, along with the rest of the estate, were to be divided. But there was a catch. There was a piece of land, 42 acres in the Green Mountains of Vermont, with a small cabin on it and a stream that ran along the eastern edge. That land had been in the family of Harold for 4 generations, and Harold had specified, in writing, that it was to go to me. Not to my mother. Not to Marcus. To me. Rachel Bellamy, his only granddaughter. I sat on the edge of my bed in Hartford, listening to my grandmother breathe, and I felt the room tilt around me. I asked her why. Why me? Why not Marcus, who was older, who was the firstborn grandson, who would have been the obvious choice in any traditional family? And my grandmother laughed, a small sad laugh, and she told me that Harold had loved me in a particular way. She said that when I was 3 years old, I had walked with him through that piece of land on a summer afternoon, and I had asked him why the stream made different sounds in different places. He had not known the answer, but he had loved the question. He had loved that I noticed. He had told my grandmother that night that I had the soul of someone who belonged in those woods. He had also seen, even back then, how my parents treated me. Even at 3, even at 4. He had seen the way my mother praised Marcus and corrected me. He had seen the way my father bought Marcus little wooden trucks at the hardware store and never thought to buy anything for me. And he had decided in his quiet way that he was going to make sure I had something of my own. Something that no one could take from me. Something that was just mine, but that is not what happened. Because when Harold died, my mother and her brother, my Uncle Gregory, hired a lawyer, and that lawyer, a man named Walter Pemberton, was a friend of the family of my uncle. My grandmother did not know all the details even now, but she knew the outcome. The will was contested. The land was placed into a trust, and the trust was managed by my mother, who was the executor of the estate. 42 acres did not come to me at age 18, the way Harold had specified. They did not come to me at 21. They did not come to me at 25. They were quietly absorbed into the family of my mother and father, who used the land as collateral on a loan in 2003 to help my brother get into a private school. That was how Marcus had gone to the school where he met the people who got him into the California University. That was how the chain reaction had started. With my land, with my inheritance. Stolen in everything but name by the two people who could not drive 45 minutes to my wedding. I could not speak for a long time. My grandmother kept saying my name, asking if I was still on the line. I finally managed to say, "Yes, I am here, Grandma." And she told me the rest. She told me that she had known about it all these years, but she had been afraid to say anything. She had been afraid of losing her own daughter. She had been afraid of being cut off from the grandchildren. She had been afraid, plain and simple, of the wrath of my mother. But the hip surgery had scared her. The rehab had scared her more. She had watched a woman in the bed next to her die in the middle of the night without ever calling her own daughter, and she had decided she was not going to leave this earth with this secret still in her chest. She told me that the original will, the one Harold had signed, was in a safety deposit box at a small bank in Brattleboro, Vermont. She had the key. She had kept it taped to the bottom of a teacup in her china cabinet for 26 years. She had been waiting, she said, for the right moment. And the right moment was the night my own mother did not show up to my wedding. That was the night my grandmother decided that whatever loyalty she had left for her daughter was officially gone. I asked her if she was sure. I asked her if she understood what she was doing. I asked her if she wanted me to come up to Vermont. And she said yes to all three. She said she had already called her own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Hollis, and made an appointment for the second week of January. She wanted me to be there. She wanted me to bring my husband. She wanted to put everything on paper in front of a witness before anything else happened to her. I hung up the phone, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. Daniel came in from the living room and asked me if I was okay. I told him to sit down. I told him everything my grandmother had said, and Daniel, who is the calmest man I have ever met, who balances my whole anxious nervous system just by being in the room, looked at me with his mouth slightly open and said one word. He said, "Wow." We did not sleep that night. We sat at the kitchen table and we drank coffee and we tried to make sense of it. Daniel kept asking me questions. How big is 42 acres? Where exactly is it? What is it worth? I did not know the answers. I had never even seen the land, as far as I could remember, although I must have been there with my grandfather that summer afternoon when I was 3. I had a vague memory of a stream, and the smell of pine needles, and a man with sawdust on his hands lifting me onto his shoulders. But that was all. I had been told for my entire adult life that my grandfather had died with very little to leave behind, that the lumber business had been struggling, that everyone in the family had received a small inheritance, and that was that. I had received nothing. I had assumed there was nothing to receive. That had been the story. And the story had been a lie. I did the math that night, sitting at the kitchen table, 42 acres in southern Vermont, with a cabin and a stream and access to a road. I looked up some recent land sales in the area on my phone. Vermont land prices had gone up dramatically over the last decade, especially in areas near ski resorts and small artisan towns. I found a comparable parcel 38 acres about 20 miles from where my grandmother lived, that had sold the previous summer for almost $1 million. Mine, if it was really mine, was probably worth around $1,100,000. Maybe more, with the cabin. $1,100,000, stolen from a 7-year-old girl. Used to send her brother to private school. Used to buy a life that excluded her. Used by 2 people who said the drive to her wedding was too long. I did not cry. I did not yell. I felt something else, something I had not felt before. I felt a kind of cold clarity, like the moment when you finally understand the shape of a puzzle that has been confusing you for years. I looked at Daniel and I said, "We are going to Vermont in January. And we are not going to tell anyone in my family that we are going, and when we come back, I am going to take everything that was stolen from me, every penny of it, and I am going to do it legally, and I am going to do it loudly, and I am never going to apologize for it." Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. He said, "I am with you. Whatever you need." That was the first time in my life I had ever felt like someone was truly on my side. 4 weeks between that phone call and our trip to Vermont were the longest 4 weeks of my life. I went to work every day. I balanced spreadsheets. I attended meetings. I smiled at my coworkers. And underneath all of it, I was running calculations in my head that had nothing to do with the quarterly report. I was thinking about a piece of land I had never seen and a will I had never read and a grandfather I barely remembered who had loved me enough to try to protect me from the people who were supposed to love me first. I did not call my mother. I did not call my father. I did not call Marcus. My mother kept texting me, and her texts started to change in tone. The first week of January, she sent me a message that said, "Rachel, I do not understand why you are being so cold. We sent a beautiful card and a check for $200. Most parents would not even do that much. $200. As a wedding gift. From the 2 people who had paid for a 4-year private university for my brother." I read that text, and I laughed out loud in the middle of my office, and my coworker Janelle looked at me like I had finally lost it. Maybe I had, or maybe I had finally found something. I did not respond to the text. I did not respond to any of them. I just kept saving every single one in a folder on my phone, because Daniel had suggested, very gently, that we should keep records of everything. He had a friend who was a lawyer in Boston, and his friend had said that in cases involving family estates and contested wills, documentation was everything. So I documented every text, every voicemail, every email. I screenshotted them all and put them in a folder labeled with my mother of the full name, Margaret Whitfield Bellamy. The woman who taught me to read. The woman who taught me to be afraid of taking up space. On January 13th, 2025, Daniel and I drove up to Vermont. It was a Monday. The roads were icy in patches, and the trees were heavy with snow. We had told my office that we were taking a few personal days. We had told no one else where we were going. The drive took us about 4 hours, and we stopped twice for coffee. Daniel did most of the driving, because my hands were shaking too much to hold the wheel steady. We arrived at the house of my grandmother just before noon. Her little cottage in Brattleboro looked exactly the way I remembered it from my last visit, which had been almost 6 years ago, before my own life had gotten too busy, and my mother had subtly made it harder and harder to plan trips up there. The front porch had a wreath on the door made of dried lavender. The chimney was puffing out gray smoke. The whole place looked like a postcard. I parked the car, and I sat there for a moment before getting out, and Daniel squeezed my knee and said, "Take your time." My grandmother opened the door before I could knock. She was smaller than I remembered. Her hair was completely white now, and she was using a cane to walk, but her eyes were the same. Bright, sharp, a little bit mischievous. She put her hand on my cheek and she said, "Oh, my Rachel, you look just like him." And I knew she meant my grandfather. I started crying right there on her front porch, and she patted my back like I was still 7 years old, and she said, "Come inside, sweetheart. The kettle is on." We sat in her kitchen and we drank tea, and she told me more of the story. things she had not said on the phone. She told me that Harold had been suspicious of my mother for years. He had seen the way Margaret manipulated people, the way she always positioned herself as the victim, the way she used her own children as accessories rather than as people. Harold had told my grandmother, one night about a year before he died, that he was worried about what would happen to me if anything happened to him. He had said, "Eleanor, that girl has nobody in her corner." Not really. Marcus has everybody, and Rachel has nobody. We have to fix that. That was when he had written the will. He had used a lawyer in Burlington, not a family friend, specifically because he did not trust anyone connected to my mother of the brother. The lawyer of his name was Stuart Hennessy, and he had retired in 2010 and moved to Florida. But Stuart had been a thorough man, and according to my grandmother, he had kept copies of every will he ever drafted. She had already tried to reach him through Patricia Hollis, the lawyer she had hired. Patricia had been able to confirm that Stuart was still alive, living in a retirement community in Sarasota, and that he had the original file. Patricia was going to fly down to Florida the following week to retrieve a certified copy. My grandmother also told me about Walter Pemberton, the lawyer my mother and Uncle Gregory had hired to contest the will. Walter was now in his 70s and still practicing in a small office in Hartford, Connecticut, the same city where I lived, the same city where my parents lived. My grandmother said that Patricia had run a quiet check on Walter, and Walter had a history. He had been censured twice by the Connecticut bar for ethical violations. Nothing big enough to lose his license, but enough to show a pattern. My grandmother believed, and Patricia believed, that Walter and my mother had used a combination of intimidation and procedural tricks to push the will through probate in a way that quietly transferred control of the land to my mother as trustee. The land had then been used as collateral, and over the years, the value of the land had been slowly absorbed into the assets of my parents. None of it was legal, in a clean way. All of it could be challenged. My grandmother handed me the safety deposit box key. It was a small brass key on a faded blue ribbon. She told me that the box was at a bank called Green Mountain Savings, just 3 blocks from her house. She told me that the box was in her name and mine. She had added me as a co-owner years ago, without telling anyone, just in case. She told me that the original copy of the will, signed by Harold and witnessed by 2 of his employees from the lumberyard, was inside. Daniel and I went to the bank that afternoon. I showed my driver license. I signed the card, and a young woman in a navy blue suit led us into a small private room with a heavy metal box sitting on the table. She left us alone. I sat down. I unlocked the box. Inside, there was a manila envelope. Yellowed at the edges, the words "Estate of Harold Whitfield" were written across the front in faded blue ink. I opened it with hands that did not feel like mine. There were 3 documents inside. The will, 6 pages long, typed on a typewriter, with original signatures in blue pen. A deed for the 42 acres, with the legal description of the land. And a handwritten letter, folded into thirds, addressed to me. My name was on the front of the letter in shaky blue handwriting. To Rachel, when she is old enough to understand. I unfolded the letter. Paper smelled like old cedar. My grandfather of the words were short and simple, and they said the things that no one else in my family had ever said to me. He said he had watched me as a baby and known immediately that I was different. He said I had a quiet wisdom in my eyes, even at 1 year old. He said he was sorry he would not be there to see me grow up. He said the land was mine, and the cabin was mine, and the stream was mine, and he hoped that one day I would walk those 42 acres and feel him there beside me. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it back up, and I put it in my coat pocket, and I told Daniel to take me to the land. The drive from the bank to the land took about 40 minutes. The roads got narrower, and the trees got taller, and the snow on the side of the road got deeper. Daniel was driving carefully, both hands on the wheel, his eyes scanning for ice. I sat in the passenger seat with my coat pocket pressed against my chest, feeling the letter through the fabric. The address my grandmother had given me led us down a small gravel road that had been recently plowed. The plowing surprised me. I had expected the place to be abandoned, maybe overgrown, maybe falling apart, but the gravel road was clear, and the trees along the edges had been trimmed back, and when we came around the final bend, I saw something that made me grab Daniel of the arm hard enough to leave a mark. There was a cabin. A real cabin. Painted dark red, with white trim around the windows, and a stone chimney, and a green metal roof. There was smoke coming out of the chimney. There was a Subaru parked in front of it. And there was a man standing on the front porch, holding a shovel, looking at us like we were the ones who did not belong there. I felt my stomach drop. Daniel slowed the car and rolled down the window. The man on the porch was in his 50s, maybe early 60s, with a gray beard and a red flannel coat. He set the shovel down and walked toward us. I rolled down my window too. The cold air hit my face like a slap. He asked us, polite but firm, if he could help us. I said, "I am sorry. I think there has been a mistake. I was told this land belonged to my family." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he asked me my name. I told him, Rachel Bellamy, granddaughter of Harold Whitfield. His face changed. Something in him softened. He took off his glove and he reached his hand through the window and he said, "You are Harold of the granddaughter. The little one. He talked about you all the time." He stepped back from the car and he gestured for us to get out. He said his name was Roy Castellano. He had worked at the lumberyard of my grandfather for 22 years. After Harold died, Roy had stayed on as a caretaker for the cabin. He had been paid every month in cash by a company in Vermont that owned the title to the property. He had assumed the company was a family trust. He had taken care of the place for 26 years without ever knowing who the real owner was supposed to be. I asked him who paid him. He told me the name of the company, Whitfield Bellamy Holdings LLC, the same name I had seen on tax documents that my mother had asked me to sign once, when I was 19 years old, claiming it was for college financial aid paperwork. I had signed those documents without reading them. I had been a kid. I had trusted her. Daniel made a small sound in the back of his throat. He had heard me say that part. He understood what it meant. My mother had been quietly using my legal signature on documents related to a company that held the title to land that was supposed to be mine. I did not know yet exactly how deep that went, but I could feel the shape of it. It was bigger than I had imagined. Roy invited us inside the cabin. He said he had a fire going and coffee on the stove. I stepped onto the porch, and I felt something strange happen in my chest, a kind of recognition that was older than my memory. The boards under my feet creaked in a specific way. The smell of pine and wood smoke hit me, and for a second I was 3 years old again, standing next to a man in a flannel coat who was lifting me onto his shoulders. The inside of the cabin was small but beautiful, wood paneling on the walls, a stone fireplace with a fire crackling, 2 leather chairs, a small kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a loft upstairs where I could see the edge of a quilt hanging over the railing. Roy had clearly taken care of the place with love. There were jars of preserves on the kitchen shelf. There was a row of work boots by the door. There was a calendar on the wall, current, marked with dates and weather notes. We sat down by the fire, and Roy poured us coffee in heavy ceramic mugs. He looked at me for a long time before he started talking. He said, "I am going to tell you some things that are going to make you angry. Are you ready?" I said I was. Roy told me that for years, men had come up from Connecticut to look at the property. Men in suits, real estate developers, forestry agents, people who wanted to log the land for the maple syrup operations, or buy it for vacation home developments, or take pieces of it for ski resort expansion. He said my mother and my uncle Gregory had been trying to sell the land in pieces for almost a decade. They had not succeeded, mostly because Vermont land law made it difficult to subdivide and sell timber rights when there was a single titled parcel with old water rights attached to it. The stream that ran through the eastern edge of the land was protected, and that protection had been the only thing holding back the sale. Roy said that in 2023, my uncle Gregory had come up personally with a developer from Boston. They had walked the entire property. They had taken measurements. They had talked about a price of $1,400,000, with the buyer planning to flip the cabin and clear-cut about half the acreage for a small luxury cabin community. The deal had fallen through because the buyer of the lawyer had flagged some issues with the original transfer of title, issues that had to do with a will that had been contested in 1998. I felt the room get very quiet. I asked Roy if he had any documentation. He went to a closet in the corner of the cabin, and he pulled out a banker box. He set it on the floor in front of me. Inside the box, neatly organized, were 26 years of records. Every check stub, every property tax receipt, every letter from the lawyer of my uncle, every visit log, every photograph Roy had taken of damage and repairs over the years. He looked at me and he said, "I always knew something was not right. I do not know why, but I always knew." I started keeping records about 8 years in. I do not know if any of this helps you, but it is yours. Everything in this box is yours, just like the cabin is yours. I could not speak. Daniel reached over and took the box from Roy and set it on his lap. Then he looked at Roy and he said, "Why are you telling us all this? Why now? Why us?" Roy smiled, sadly. He said, "Because I knew Harold. Harold was a good man, and Harold loved that little granddaughter. He used to talk about her when we were stacking lumber in the yard. He used to say, 'That girl is going to do something special with her life if her family does not crush her first.'" Roy looked at me. He said, "You do not look crushed to me." I said, "I am not. Not anymore." We stayed at the cabin for another 2 hours. Roy showed us around. He showed us the stream, frozen over now but still beautiful. And he showed us the small storage shed where Harold had kept his tools. And he showed us a hollow oak tree near the property line where, according to Roy, Harold had once told him he had buried a tin box with letters in it. We did not dig that day, but I noted the location. Roy gave us his phone number. He told us he would help us with anything we needed. He said the place was ours, and he was going to stay until we told him otherwise. We left as the sun was going down. The sky over the mountains was the color of a peach. I drove this time, because my hands had finally stopped shaking. Daniel was quiet next to me, going through the banker box of Roy with a small flashlight, reading documents one by one. About halfway back to the house of my grandmother, he looked up from a paper and said, "Rachel, you need to see this." He held up a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a tax form from 2017, with my signature on it, authorizing the sale of timber rights on a small portion of the property for $47,000. Money I had never seen, money that had gone directly into a bank account I did not own. Forgery. Plain and simple. And we now had proof. We drove back to the house of my grandmother in silence. The $47,000 timber sale was just one piece of paper in a much bigger pile, but it was the piece that turned everything from theoretical to legal, from a story to a case. I had a copy of a federal tax document with a forged signature on it. That was not just family drama. That was a crime. My grandmother was waiting for us with dinner on the table. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, and a loaf of bread she had baked herself that afternoon. The smell hit me as soon as we walked in the door, and I realized I had not eaten anything since breakfast. We sat down and we ate, and I told my grandmother everything about Roy, about the cabin, about the developer my Uncle Gregory had brought up in 2023, about the timber sale with my forged signature. She listened without interrupting. When I was finished, she set down her fork and she folded her hands in her lap and she said, "Well, now we know." The next morning, we met with Patricia Hollis, the lawyer my grandmother had hired. Patricia of the office was a small brick building in downtown Brattleboro, with a hand-painted sign on the door and a golden retriever asleep in the waiting room. Patricia was in her 50s, with short gray hair and rimless glasses. She shook my hand firmly and led us into a conference room. She had already reviewed the will, the deed, and the letter. She had already spoken to Stuart Hennessy in Florida, who had confirmed that the will we had was the authentic one and that he was willing to provide a sworn statement. Patricia laid out the situation in clear terms. Under the will of Harold Whitfield, signed in 1995, the 42 acres in the cabin were to be held in trust for me until I turned 21, at which point full ownership was to transfer to me directly. The trustee, my mother, had a fiduciary duty to manage the property in my interest and to transfer it to me when I came of age. She had not done that. Instead, she had treated the property as if it were her own, used it as collateral, attempted to sell portions of it, and apparently forged my signature on at least one transaction. The remedies available to me, Patricia explained, were significant. I could file a civil suit to recover ownership of the property, which would be relatively straightforward given the documentation we now had. I could file a separate suit for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking damages for the value of any income generated by the property that should have gone to me, plus the equity that had been extracted from it over the years. And, separately, I had the option of filing a criminal complaint regarding the forged signature, which could be pursued by the state attorney general of the office. Patricia paused and looked at me carefully. She said, "Rachel, before we go further, I need you to think about what you actually want. Do you want the property back? Do you want financial compensation? Do you want criminal charges against your parents? Or some combination of these? Path forward depends on what you are willing to do and what you are willing to live with." I had been thinking about this question for 4 weeks. I had run through every possible version of the answer. I had pictured my mother in handcuffs. I had pictured her crying. I had pictured her apologizing. I had pictured myself screaming at her in a courtroom. I had pictured myself walking away with the deed and never speaking to her again. None of those versions felt right by themselves, but one combination did. I told Patricia what I wanted. I wanted the property fully and legally restored to my name. I wanted full financial restitution for the timber sale, the loan collateral usage, and any other extracted value, with interest, calculated as accurately as possible. I wanted a written, signed acknowledgement from my mother and Uncle Gregory of what they had done. And I wanted them to know that if they refused to settle out of court, I would absolutely file criminal charges and let the state handle the rest. I was not interested in destroying them, but I was interested in justice. And I wanted them to know that the choice was theirs. Patricia nodded. She said, "That is a reasonable approach. It gives them an exit, but it makes the cost of refusing very high." She also told me something that surprised me. She said, "In most family estate cases, the difficult party will refuse to settle and then will collapse under the weight of discovery. People who have spent decades manipulating their families are usually not prepared for what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a real legal process. Discovery will surface every email, every text, every bank record. They will not enjoy that." Daniel asked her what the timeline looked like. Patricia said that with the documentation we had, she could draft a demand letter within 10 days. She would send it certified mail to my parents and to my Uncle Gregory. They would have 30 days to respond. If they refused to engage, she would file the civil suit in Vermont, which had jurisdiction because the property was in Vermont. The whole process, from demand letter to settlement or judgment, would likely take 6 to 9 months. I asked her how much it would cost. Patricia said her hourly rate, but she also offered a contingency arrangement on the breach of fiduciary duty claim, given how strong the evidence was. She would take a smaller percentage of whatever was recovered, capped at a maximum amount, in exchange for not charging me hourly on that portion. I appreciated that. I told her we would proceed. We left her office around noon. The cold air on the street felt different than it had the day before. It felt cleaner somehow, like a thing I could breathe without it hurting. Daniel and I walked to a small diner across the street and ordered grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. We sat in a booth by the window. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Daniel said, "Are you okay?" I thought about the question for a minute. I told him I was not okay, but I was something. I was settled. I was clear. I was no longer carrying a fog of confusion about my own family. I knew now exactly what they had done. I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. And the not knowing, the years and years of not knowing, that had been the heaviest weight of my life. Knowing was lighter, even when what I knew was ugly. We drove back to Hartford that afternoon. The drive felt shorter than the drive up had felt. When we got home, I sat down at the kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I started typing. I made a list of every memory I had of being treated unfairly as a child. I made a list of every financial transaction I could remember signing for my mother. I made a list of every conversation I could remember about money, about Marcus, about the will, about my grandfather. I sent the list to Patricia. She had asked me to document everything I could remember, because memories were evidence too. For the next 10 days, I lived in a strange kind of suspension. I went to work. I came home. I had dinner with Daniel. I did not call my parents. They kept calling me. My mother left a voicemail on January 22nd that I will never forget. She said, "Rachel, I do not know what is going on with you, but this silent treatment is childish. You are a grown woman. We sent you a wedding card. We sent you a check. We even called you over Christmas, and you did not answer. Your father is hurt. I am hurt. Your brother thinks you are having some kind of breakdown. We are starting to wonder if Daniel is isolating you from us. If you do not call me back by the end of the week, I am going to call Daniel of the mother and have a conversation with her." I saved the voicemail. I forwarded it to Patricia. I did not call back. On January 24th, Patricia sent the demand letter. 3 copies. 1 to my parents at their home address, 1 to my Uncle Gregory at his office in Connecticut, 1 to Walter Pemberton, the lawyer who had handled the original probate. As a courtesy, the letter laid out the facts. The original will, the 42 acres, the breach of fiduciary duty, the forged signature, the total amount sought in restitution, which Patricia and I had calculated approximately $1,740,000, including interest and damages. The letter gave them 30 days to respond. The clock started ticking on January 25th. On the morning of January 27th, my phone exploded. My mother called me 11 times in a row. My father called me 4 times. Marcus called me twice. My Uncle Gregory called me once. I did not answer any of them. I had been instructed by Patricia not to communicate with them directly, under any circumstances, and to forward any messages to her office. I watched my phone light up on the kitchen counter, over and over, and I felt nothing. No fear. No guilt. No urge to pick up. I felt like a person standing on the shore watching a storm out at sea. The storm was real. The storm was loud. But I was not in it anymore. The first physical response from my family came on January 29th. My mother showed up at my house. She drove the 45 minutes she had not been willing to drive for my wedding. She rang my doorbell at 7:30 in the morning, while I was making coffee in my pajamas, and Daniel had to answer the door because I was standing in the kitchen with my hand frozen on the handle of the coffee pot. I could hear her voice from the hallway. She was using the tone she always used when she was trying to be sweet, the one I had grown up calling her honey tone, the voice she used when she wanted something. She was telling Daniel that she just needed to talk to me, that this was all a misunderstanding, that I was clearly going through something, and she was worried about me. Daniel, bless him, did not even let her into the foyer. He stood in the doorway, and he told her, very calmly, that I was not available, that any communication needed to go through my lawyer, and that he was going to ask her to leave the property now. She did not leave. She started crying. She raised her voice. She said, "I am her mother. Do you know what it is like to have your own child cut you out like this? Do you know what it feels like?" Daniel said yes, he could imagine. But the answer was still no, she could not come in. She tried to push past him. He blocked the door with his arm. She called him a name I will not repeat here. He told her, again, to leave. He told her that if she did not leave within the next 30 seconds, he was going to call the police. He had his phone in his hand. He showed it to her. She left. She got back in her car, and she sat in our driveway for almost 20 minutes before she finally pulled out and drove away. I watched her through the upstairs window, my coffee gone cold in my hand. I had not said a single word to her. I had not even seen her face directly. I had only heard her voice, and the strange thing was, hearing her voice, the voice I had heard every day for the first 18 years of my life, did not move me the way I had expected it would. It sounded like a stranger. It sounded like someone playing a part. It sounded like a woman who had practiced being a mother but had never really been one. Patricia called me an hour later, after Daniel had filed an incident report with the local police department, mostly to document the visit for the case file. Patricia said that this was a common response. She said that controlling parents, when confronted with consequences, often resort to dramatic in-person displays designed to overwhelm and shame their adult children back into compliance. She told me I had done the right thing. She told me to install a doorbell camera if I did not already have one. We did not. Daniel went out that afternoon and bought one and installed it that evening. On January 31st, Walter Pemberton responded to the demand letter. He sent a brief letter to Patricia, on his firm letterhead, claiming that the matter had been settled in 1998, that the statute of limitations had long since passed, and that any attempt to relitigate the estate of Harold Whitfield would be vigorously defended. He attached no documents. He cited no specific legal authority. It was, according to Patricia, the legal equivalent of waving a stick to scare off a bear. She laughed when she read it to me over the phone. She said, "Rachel, this letter tells me that he is not prepared. He is buying time." Patricia responded the next day with a much longer letter. She cited specific Vermont and Connecticut statutes regarding trusts, fiduciary duty, and fraud. She pointed out that the statute of limitations for fraud begins to run from the date of discovery, not the date of the original act, and that I had discovered the fraud only on December 18, 2024, when my grandmother called me. She attached copies of the original will, the deed, the timber sale document with the forged signature, and a sworn affidavit from Stuart Hennessy in Florida. She made it clear that the next step, if the parties did not engage in good faith, would be a civil filing in Vermont Superior Court, plus a referral to the Connecticut Attorney General regarding the forgery. Walter did not respond for almost 2 weeks. In that 2 weeks, the pressure on me from my family escalated. Marcus called me from Phoenix. He left a long voicemail in which he tried to be the reasonable one. He said he understood I was upset, but I was tearing the family apart. He said our parents were old, and they did not deserve this. He said that whatever I thought I was owed, surely it was not worth losing my family. He said, "Rachel, money is not everything. Family is everything." I listened to that voicemail twice, the word money in his mouth, coming from the man who had been handed a private school education and a private university and a 4-bedroom house in a gated community by the very same parents who had skipped my wedding, made me angrier than anything else that had happened. Money is not everything. Said by the man who had received almost everything because of money that had been stolen from his sister. I did not respond to Marcus either. My father sent me a letter. An actual paper letter, on yellow legal pad paper, in his handwriting. The handwriting was shaky. He was 71 years old, and his hands had started trembling a few years ago. He wrote that he was sorry he had not come to my wedding. He wrote that it had been his fault, not the fault of my mother, that he had been the one who had been too tired to make the drive. He wrote that he loved me very much. He wrote that he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive him. I read that letter 3 times. I cried, a little, the first time. I thought, for a moment, that maybe my father was different. Maybe he had not known. Maybe he had been swept along by my mother for 50 years and was finally trying to reach me. I almost called him. I almost called Patricia and asked if I could have a private conversation with just him. Then I noticed the postscript at the bottom of the second page. It was small, almost an afterthought. He wrote, by the way, "Your mother and I have been talking to Walter, and we would like to invite you to come to dinner so we can talk through this misunderstanding about Grandpa Harold of the estate. I am sure once we sit down face to face, we can clear everything up. Please respond to your mother." The letter was a setup. The apology was bait. My father was not reaching out as a father. He was reaching out as a co-conspirator who had been given the task of softening me up. Even his handwriting, even his trembling old hands, had been weaponized. I scanned the letter. I sent it to Patricia. She added it to the file. On February 11th, Walter Pemberton called Patricia. He had finally, apparently, reviewed the documents we had sent. He requested a meeting. He suggested a mediation, with all parties present. Patricia, after consulting with me, agreed to a mediation, but with strict conditions. The mediation would take place in Vermont, not Connecticut. It would be conducted by a neutral retired judge selected by both sides. I would not be in the same room as my mother, my father, or my Uncle Gregory. We would communicate through the mediator. The mediation would be limited to discussion of financial settlement and transfer of the property. Any discussion of personal grievances or family reconciliation was off the table. Walter agreed to all the conditions. The mediation was scheduled for March 3, 2025, in Burlington. The 3 weeks between February 11th and March 3rd were quiet. My mother stopped calling. My father stopped calling. Marcus stopped calling. I think Walter must have told them, finally, that any further contact with me would damage their position. The silence was strange. After 34 years of being shouted over, ignored, dismissed, and managed, I was suddenly being treated like a person they were a little bit afraid of. It was an unfamiliar feeling. I did not hate it. Daniel and I went to Vermont 2 days early. We stayed with my grandmother, who had grown stronger over the past 2 months, but was still moving slowly with her cane. She made us a roast chicken on the night before the mediation. She lit 2 candles on the table. She said grace, which she did not usually do, and in her grace she thanked God for sending Harold the wisdom to write the will, and she thanked God for sending me the strength to do what Harold had wanted done. After dinner, she pulled me aside. She held my face in both of her hands, the way she had held it on the porch the first day I arrived. She said, "Rachel, no matter what happens tomorrow, you have already won. You have already taken yourself back. Everything else is just paperwork." I went to bed early that night. For the first time in months, I slept all the way through. The mediation took place in a wood-paneled conference room on the 4th floor of an office building in downtown Burlington. The retired judge, a soft-spoken man named Wendell Harrington, who must have been about 70, sat at the head of a long oak table. Patricia and I were placed in a smaller room down the hallway. My parents, my Uncle Gregory, and Walter Pemberton were in another room on the opposite side of the floor. Judge Harrington went back and forth between us. A process called shuttle mediation. It was designed exactly for situations like ours, where the parties could not be trusted to behave themselves in the same room. The morning began with opening statements, which we submitted in writing. Patricia of the statement was 8 pages long, carefully built, with citations to the will, the deed, the letter from Harold, the forged tax document, the affidavits from Stuart Hennessy and Roy Castellano, the bank records, and my grandmother of the written statement. Walter of the opening statement was 3 pages long. According to Judge Harrington, who summarized it for us when he came into our room, it consisted primarily of a defense based on the statute of limitations and a claim that my parents had been acting in my best interest by managing the property responsibly until I was emotionally and financially ready to handle such a large asset. Patricia almost laughed when he said that. She said, "Your Honor, with respect, my client is a 34-year-old senior accountant. She has been managing larger portfolios than this property for clients for over a decade. The idea that her parents were waiting for her to be ready is not credible." Judge Harrington nodded. He said he was not there to evaluate credibility. He was there to find common ground. The first offer from the other side came around 11 in the morning. They offered to transfer the title of the property to my name and to pay me a lump sum of $150,000 as a one-time settlement, in exchange for a full release of all claims, a non-disclosure agreement, and a written statement from me that the original probate had been conducted in good faith. Patricia looked at me. I looked at her. We both started shaking our heads at the same time. The non-disclosure agreement was a non-starter. The written statement absolving them of bad faith was insulting. The $150,000 was less than 1/10 of what we were asking for. Patricia drafted a counteroffer. We would accept the transfer of title and a settlement of $1,600,000, payable within 90 days, with no non-disclosure agreement and no exculpatory statement. We would, however, agree not to pursue criminal charges for the forgery if the financial settlement was paid in full and on time. Judge Harrington took the offer down the hall. The response came back at 1 in the afternoon, after a long lunch break during which Patricia and I ate sandwiches in the conference room and did not say much. The other side had countered at $375,000. They still wanted the non-disclosure agreement. They had dropped the demand for an exculpatory statement. Patricia and I went back and forth on this one. The non-disclosure agreement was clearly the line my mother and Uncle Gregory cared most about. They did not want me to be able to tell this story. They were apparently willing to pay for my silence. The amount they were willing to pay was, in Patricia of the experience, an indicator of how scared they were. $375,000 was real money to them. The fact that they were dangling it specifically in exchange for an NDA told us everything we needed to know about how much damage they thought the truth could do to them. I told Patricia I would not sign an NDA under any circumstances. The whole point of doing this was to take back the truth of my own life. I had spent 34 years being told a false version of my own story. I was not going to spend the next 34 years legally prevented from telling the real one. Patricia drafted the next counteroffer. We would accept $1,400,000, plus the transfer of title, plus a written admission from my mother and Uncle Gregory acknowledging that the original probate had not properly transferred the property to me as the intended beneficiary, and that the timber sale of 2017 had been conducted without my knowledge or authorization. We would agree to release all civil claims in exchange. We would not agree to a non-disclosure agreement. We would not agree to pursue or not pursue any criminal action regarding the forgery, leaving that question entirely to the state to handle. Judge Harrington took this offer down the hall. He came back 40 minutes later. He sat down across from us, and he looked tired. He said, "Walter is asking for a private word with you, Patricia. Just the two of you. He says it is important." Patricia agreed. She left the room. I sat alone for almost an hour, watching the snow start to fall outside the window. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the cabin. I thought about Roy, who was probably tending the fire right now in that cabin, 40 minutes south of us. I thought about how strange it was that an entire life had been built and almost destroyed because of a piece of paper signed in 1995 by a man with sawdust on his hands. When Patricia came back, she sat down slowly. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. She said, "Your mother is willing to sign the admission of wrongdoing, but only if you agree to one additional condition." I asked her what the condition was. She said, "Your mother wants to meet with you. Privately. Just the two of you." 20 minutes. No lawyers in the room. After the settlement is signed, I felt my stomach tighten. I thought about the woman who had stood on my porch in January, crying and screaming. I thought about the woman who had skipped my wedding. I thought about the woman who had used my forged signature on a federal tax document. I told Patricia no. Patricia said, "I thought you would say that." I told them no already, but I wanted to bring it to you anyway. She is not in a position to be making demands. The admission of wrongdoing is the price of the settlement. If she will not sign it, we walk out of here and file the civil suit on Monday morning, and the criminal referral on Monday afternoon. She left again. 20 minutes later, Judge Harrington came back into the room. He said, "They have agreed to your terms. All of them. They are drafting the final settlement now." He looked at me with something close to respect, which surprised me. He said, "You held your line well today. Most people lose their nerve halfway through a mediation like this." I did not say anything. I just nodded. I felt something building in my chest that I could not yet name. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was something quieter. Maybe satisfaction. Maybe peace. Maybe just the feeling of finally being heard. The final settlement was signed at 4:15 in the afternoon. The property title would be transferred to me within 30 days. The cash settlement of $1,400,000 would be paid in 3 installments over 90 days, with the first installment of $700,000 due within 15 days, secured by a lien on a property owned by my Uncle Gregory. The written admission of wrongdoing, 2 pages long, signed by my mother and my Uncle Gregory and notarized in the room, became part of the public record of the settlement. We walked out of the building into the falling snow. Patricia hugged me. Daniel hugged me. He had been waiting in the lobby for almost 8 hours. He had not eaten. He looked exhausted and proud at the same time. We got in the car and we drove back to my grandmother of the house. And when I walked through the front door, she was sitting in her chair by the fire, and she looked up at me. And I just nodded, and she put her hand over her mouth and started to cry without any sound. That night, we sat by the fire, the 3 of us, and we drank a glass of red wine. I told my grandmother everything. She listened. She held my hand. When I finished, she said only one thing. She said, Harold knew. He always knew you were the one who would do it. I want to tell you that the moment I signed that settlement, my life became simple. I want to tell you that the months after the mediation were peaceful, that I felt healed, that I went home and never thought about my parents again. But that is not how any of this works. The legal part of it ended in March. The emotional part of it had a much longer tail. The first installment of the settlement, $700,000, arrived in my account on March 17, 2025. I watched the deposit hit, and I felt almost nothing. I had expected to feel something dramatic, but mostly I just felt tired. I called Patricia to confirm. She told me to take a vacation. She told me to leave the country if I could. She said that, in her experience, the period immediately after a settlement was the hardest psychologically, because the structure of the fight disappeared, and what was left was just the wreckage of the relationships underneath. I did not leave the country. I went back to work the following week. I told my boss what had happened, in broad strokes, because she had noticed that I had taken a number of personal days and seemed distracted. My boss was a woman named Linda Park, 56 years old, with 2 grown children and a husband she had been married to for 31 years. She listened to my story without interrupting. When I was finished, she got up from her desk, came around to my side, and gave me a hug. She said, "Rachel, I always thought there was something heavy in you. I am glad you put some of it down." The second installment of the settlement arrived on April 15th. The third arrived on June 12th. The full $1,400,000 was now in my possession, sitting in a series of accounts that Daniel and I were managing carefully. Daniel had insisted, very early on, that the money was mine, not ours. He had told me, the night the first installment arrived, that he did not want a single dollar of it to come into our joint account until I had decided what I wanted to do with it. He said, "This is your inheritance. This is your story. I am not going to be a man who benefits from a wrong that was done to you when you were 7 years old." I love him for that. I will love him for that until the day I die. I sat with the money for 3 months before I started making decisions. I talked to a financial advisor, a woman named Janelle, the same Janelle who worked at my office, who had laughed at me when I laughed at my own kitchen table months earlier. Janelle helped me think through the long-term picture. Some of the money I put into a retirement account. Some of it I put into a high-yield savings account as an emergency fund. Some of it I used to pay off the remaining mortgage on the house Daniel and I lived in, which made our monthly expenses dramatically lower and our future much more flexible. I also did something else. Something I had been thinking about for a long time. I made an appointment with my grandmother of the lawyer, Patricia, and I set up a trust. The trust was in my name, but its purpose was specific. The 42 acres in Vermont, plus the cabin, plus $300,000 in liquid assets, would be held in this trust, with one specific instruction: the land would never be sold. The cabin would be maintained. The income from the property, including any timber sales conducted with sustainable practices, would go into a small fund that would be used to support children in foster care who aged out of the system and needed help getting through college. I named the trust the Harold Whitfield Memorial Trust. I had a small bronze plaque made and installed on the porch of the cabin. Plaque had my grandfather of the name on it, his birth and death dates, and one line underneath. It said, "For every child who is told they are not worth the drive." I do not know if my grandfather would have understood that line, but I think he would have liked it. Roy Castellano continued to manage the property. I paid him directly now, not through any LLC, and I gave him a raise to reflect 26 years of caretaking that had been done with love. Roy started crying when I told him. He said he had never expected to be thanked. He said taking care of the place had been its own reward. Daniel and I spent a week at the cabin in early May. We dug under the hollow oak tree that Roy had pointed out, the one where my grandfather had supposedly buried a tin box. We did not find a tin box. We found, instead, a small glass jar with a tightly screwed lid, buried about 18 inches down. Inside the jar was a piece of folded paper, brittle but legible, dated August 12, 1994. It was a list. A list of names, the names of every employee my grandfather had ever hired at the lumberyard. with a short note next to each name about who they were, what they had done well, what he had appreciated about them. Roy of the name was on the list. So were 37 others. It was not what I had expected. It was not a hidden treasure. It was something better. It was a record of a man who had paid attention, a man who had remembered the small things, a man who had cared about ordinary people. I copied the list, and I sent copies to as many of the families as I could find. Many of the employees had passed away, but their children and grandchildren were still around. The letters of thanks I received over the next few months were among the most meaningful pieces of mail I have ever gotten. Meanwhile, my parents had gone completely silent. The settlement included a clause that they were not to contact me directly, only through Patricia, for any reason for a period of 2 years. They had so far respected that clause. I do not know what they did with the news that they had to pay me $1,400,000. I do not know how they raised the money, although I suspect they sold their house and downsized, because their address on file changed in late April to a smaller place in a less expensive part of town. I do not know what they told the rest of the family. I do not know what they told their friends. I do not know if they were sorry. I do not know if they were angry. I do not know if they had any moment of recognition that this had all been their own doing. I stopped trying to know. That was the biggest shift, actually. I stopped trying to understand them. For 34 years, I had been trying to make sense of my parents. I had been trying to figure out what I had done wrong, what I could have done differently, what version of myself would have made them love me the way they loved Marcus. I had built my entire personality around answering a question that had no real answer. The question was not why do they not love me? The question was, what do I do when I accept that they do not? What I did was, I built a life that did not include them, and I found, to my surprise, that the life was bigger without them. Lighter. Brighter. I had more energy. I had more attention to give to the people who actually loved me. Daniel. My grandmother. Vivian, my best friend. My coworkers. The new friends Daniel and I were making, slowly, as we hosted small dinners at our house and went on hikes on the weekends. Marcus tried to reach me one more time in mid-May. He sent me a long email. He did not apologize. He said he had been thinking. He said he had not understood, for many years, that I had been treated differently. He said he saw it now. He said he was sorry he had not seen it sooner. He said he hoped that one day we could be siblings again, the way siblings were supposed to be. He did not ask for anything specific. He did not try to reopen the financial questions. He just said he missed me. I read his email twice. I sat with it for almost a week. Then I wrote him back. My response was short. I told him I appreciated him reaching out. I told him I was not ready to be in contact with him. I told him that being his sister, for the first 33 years of my life, had cost me more than he could possibly understand, and I needed a long break from the role. I told him that if, in some future year, we found a way to know each other as adults, separate from our parents, separate from the dynamic we had grown up in, I would consider it, but not now. Not soon. Maybe not ever. And he would have to accept that as the consequence of what had been allowed to happen to me. He did not respond. I do not know if he ever will. I have made my peace with not knowing. In July of 2025, my grandmother passed away. She had a stroke on a Tuesday morning, sitting in her kitchen drinking tea, and she was gone before the ambulance arrived. She was 87 years old. She had lived a long, full life. And she had, in her last months, given me back something I had been missing for almost 3 decades. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve what she did for me. I drove up to Vermont alone for her funeral. Daniel offered to come, but I asked him to stay home this time. I needed to do this part by myself. The funeral was at a small Methodist church in Brattleboro, the same church where my grandparents had been married in 1957. Pews were not full, but they were full enough. Patricia was there. Roy was there. Several of the names from the list in the glass jar were there, or their children were. My Uncle Gregory did not come. My mother did come, with my father. They sat in the back row. They did not approach me. I did not approach them. I delivered a brief eulogy for my grandmother. I had revised it many times, but kept it simple. She taught me during her final year that correcting a wrong is never too late, and that speaking truth at 87 years old requires immense courage. She gave me the gift of being truly seen. When I sat, the room wept. Afterward, my mother walked out in silence. My father looked at me with wet eyes before following her. I never saw either of them again. I retreated to our mountain cabin for 4 days. I left my phone behind and walked the woods. The fresh air and the sound of the stream brought me a sense of peace. I felt the presence of my grandfather and the presence of my grandmother. When I returned to Hartford, Daniel and our dog Bingo greeted me with a warm meal. We sat on the porch, and I asked him what should come next. I decided to fully fund a trust for foster youth, to write down my experiences, and to finally try for a baby at 34 years old. We began trying in August. I do not know the outcome yet, but I am determined to break the cycle of neglect. If I become a mother, that child will never question whether she is enough. The doctor says I still have time, but the window is closing. The trust now supports young adults aging out of care. 18-year-old Sasha received the first scholarship and studies environmental science. She fears the offer will vanish, but I promised her continued support in exchange for her effort and future kindness. My parents remain silent. Marcus sent a brief text in October that I did not answer. Walter Pemberton, the attorney who handled the estate in 1998, sent an apology through our lawyer Patricia. I shredded it. His regret arrived too late and served only to ease his own conscience. I chose to let it go. On Thanksgiving, I gathered with Daniel, Vivian, friends, and the mother of Daniel. We shared a meal. I expressed gratitude for the courage of my grandmother, the patience of Daniel, and the woman I have finally become. I am writing this now in late November of 2025 to release the past. I have shared fragments of my story for years, but never the whole truth. I offer it now to anyone who grew up in a home where love was measured by convenience rather than devotion. I offer 6 lessons from my journey. First, silence creates necessary space. When my mother stopped calling after my wedding, her distance allowed me to hear my own thoughts and break 34 years of confusion. Second, family requires reciprocity. Loyalty and forgiveness that flow only one way are merely control. True family loves you back, regardless of blood. Third, claiming what is rightfully yours is not greed. My mother took land that my grandfather left to me. Recovering $1,400,000 was not selfishness, but justice. I used the funds to help others, exactly as he intended. Fourth, forgiveness differs from reconciliation. I release my anger to protect my own peace, but reconciliation demands honesty and change. My parents offer neither, so I maintain my distance while wishing them peace from afar. Fifth, crises reveal true allies. My chosen family stood beside me when my blood relatives walked away. The love in my life has grown, not shrunk. Sixth, you can author your own narrative. I spent decades believing I was an afterthought. Now I know I am a granddaughter who was loved, a partner who is cherished, and a trustee who builds a better future. I will tell this new story to myself, and to any daughter I am fortunate enough to raise. The last thing I want to say is this: if you are watching this and any piece of it sounded familiar, please listen carefully. You are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not being dramatic. If your gut has been telling you for years that something is not right in your family, your gut is probably correct. Trust it. Document things. Talk to a therapist. Talk to a lawyer if there is anything financial involved. Build a chosen family, slowly, one trustworthy person at a time, and know that on the other side of all of it, there is a version of your life that is lighter and freer and more honest than the one you are living now. It is not easy to get there. It took me 34 years, but it is possible, and it is worth it. My name is Rachel Bellamy. I am 34 years old. My grandfather of the name was Harold Whitfield. My grandmother of the name was Eleanor Whitfield. The land in Vermont was always mine, and now, finally, it is. I am no longer the daughter who was left behind. I am the woman who was chosen. I was always chosen. It just took most of my life to find out. If this story moved you in any way, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and share your own experience in the comments below. If you have lived through something similar, I would love to hear how you made it through. Your story might be the one that helps someone else hold on for one more day. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves. And remember, you are worth the drive.